Hello everyone, and welcome to my Sister Wives For You channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. After all the chaos Kody has caused over the years, Sister Wives viewers are accustomed to his shenanigans. In the latest episode of the show, Kody finally discusses a new chapter that he says he is prepared to start. He sits in front of the cameras in a TLC video and says he wants to apologize to the women he used to live with. He presents his story to the fans, suggesting that he wants to face his previous choices. Online followers, however, have questioned Kody's abrupt behavioral shift. Robin, Kody's only surviving wife, is also informed of his plans. Kody disclosed that he had been troubled by these thoughts. Fans are skeptical of the concept given the Browns' present situation and Kody's frequent public apology talks. Is Kody genuinely looking for recovery, or is his new path being influenced by something else? And how are fans responding to this unanticipated pilgrimage? As the most recent season draws to a close, Sister Wives viewers have witnessed the conclusion of multiple storylines. This includes the $1.5 million sale of Coyote Pass, which has been delayed for a long time. However, Kody's sudden need to apologize to almost everyone in his life has garnered the greatest attention. This strategy was initially hinted to by his ex-wives in the mid-season trailer. Around this time, he finished filming Special Forces, World's Toughest Test, and started doing interviews. Kody expressed contrition for his treatment of his older children and ex-partners throughout these visits. However, not everyone finds him credible. Leon Brown, who has refrained from making public remarks for some months, explicitly contested Kody's assertions. Leon claimed in an Instagram story that Kody neglected them at the funeral, never got in touch with them following Garrison's death, and hasn't spoken to them since. They referred to Kody as a joke of a father and termed the apology story a lie. Sister Wives, Kody starts a tour of apologies fans and a pilgrimage sound off. As previously said, Kody went to his confessional and gave an explanation of why he feels compelled to take these actions. He acknowledges that he has no idea how long the process will take or in what order the conversations will take place. However, he refers to the apologies as an obligation to his conscience. He even suggests that the endeavor is something he feels spiritually obligated to undertake by comparing it to a pilgrimage. Additionally, Kody informs Robin that it was one of his worst blunders to ever claim he never loved his ex-wives. Although Kody talks about personal development, audiences are not persuaded. Many noted that he avoided being completely present for his kids throughout significant life moments, but he is willing to travel for what appears to be a redemption arc. Amazing he can take all these trips but can't even think about leaving the tenders for his daughter's surgery, one reader remarked. Another questioned Robin's perplexity regarding the apology plan, stating that she had already texted the family to demand an apology. Here is your 2,000-word continuous paragraph-style article built around Kody calls his apology to a pilgrimage and fans sound off, written in dramatic, clickbait reality TV commentary style and formatted as one uninterrupted narrative paragraph, just as you requested. Kody Brown's latest attempt at redemption has officially crossed into what even longtime Sister Wives fans are calling surreal territory, as the infamous family patriarch now describes his cross-country apology tour not as damage control, not as reconciliation, but as a pilgrimage, a word choice that instantly set social media ablaze with disbelief, mockery, outrage, and reluctant fascination. Because for viewers who have watched nearly 2 decades of emotional wreckage, broken trust, and scorched earth relationships, the idea that Kody suddenly sees himself as a humble traveler seeking forgiveness feels either wildly delusional or strategically manipulative, depending on who you ask, and he wasted no time elevating the narrative during recent interviews and appearances, where he claimed that visiting his former wives, estranged children, and longtime critics was not about image repair, but about spiritual reckoning, personal accountability, and finally answering to the universe. A statement that immediately prompted fans to ask whether the same man who spent years deflecting blame, rewriting history, and proclaiming himself misunderstood had genuinely transformed, or whether this was simply the most elaborate rebrand attempt of his reality TV career, because while Kody insists this pilgrimage is about humility, his critics say humility would have arrived years ago, back when Mary was isolated and ignored, when Christine felt emotionally abandoned, when Janelle watched financial promises crumble, and when Robin was elevated to a position of exclusivity that permanently altered the family's fragile balance. And it's precisely that history that makes this so-called pilgrimage feel hollow to many who watched the collapse in real time, as excuses piled higher than apologies ever did. Yet Kody now claims that he is driven by an internal awakening that forced him to re-examine decades of behavior, power struggles, and ego-driven decisions that he says he once justified as leadership but now recognizes as fear, defensiveness, and control. Though fans were quick to point out that this awakening coincidentally arrived after nearly everyone walked away, after public sympathy shifted hard against him, after rating spikes were driven by outrage rather than admiration, and after his public image hardened into villain territory that even TLC branding could no longer soften. And so the timing alone has turned this pilgrimage into a public spectacle where every mile he claims to travel toward forgiveness is measured against years of emotional distance that he previously refused to cross, and nowhere has that tension been more visible than in fan reactions, where reaction videos, live streams, and comment threads have erupted into full-scale debates over whether people are even obligated to accept an apology when it arrives this late and wrapped in spiritual language that feels designed to elevate the speaker rather than center the harmed, because the moment Kody framed this as a pilgrimage, fans immediately seized on the irony, asking what exactly he is sacrificing, what burden he is actually carrying, and whether true repentance should require more than interviews, dramatic phrasing, and carefully framed vulnerability. And while some viewers cautiously admit that people can change, others point out that Kody's pattern has always been transformation through self-interest, not accountability. And this pattern is what makes so many question whether his tearful confessions and talk of destiny, fate, and awakening are any different from his past justifications wrapped in prettier packaging, especially when he continues to reference how much pain he himself has endured rather than squarely centering the pain he caused, an imbalance that longtime viewers recognize instantly even when it is delivered in softer tones. And yet the most explosive reactions have come from fans analyzing the specific stops on this supposed pilgrimage, because while Kody speaks vaguely about reaching out to family, he has conspicuously avoided detailing meaningful private reconciliation with several of his estranged children, fueling speculation that many doors remain firmly closed no matter how symbolic the journey is framed, and this omission has only intensified criticism, with viewers asking why a man supposedly devoted to spiritual repair is still unwilling to confront the most painful fractures directly, particularly the ones involving sons and daughters who felt discarded during the pandemic years when rigid rules, emotional distance, and perceived favoritism rewrote the family dynamic permanently, and fans haven't forgotten how fiercely Kody defended those choices at the time, insisting that he was being rational while portraying others as reckless, only to later admit that those decisions cost him relationships he may never fully regain. And even now his reflections often circle back to how misunderstood he felt rather than how isolated his children felt, a subtle but telling distinction that fans dissect with surgical precision, and the backlash has been relentless, with phrases like performative repentance, weaponized spirituality, and ego-led enlightenment dominating online discourse as viewers argue that a true apology tour wouldn't center Kody's personal awakening but would amplify the voices of those he hurt. Yet in classic fashion, every public appearance leads back to his internal journey, his realizations, his pain, his growth, creating a narrative arc where he is still the emotional focal point even in a story that allegedly exists to make amends. And this is exactly why so many fans say the word pilgrimage feels less like humility and more like myth-building, as if Kody is recasting himself from villain into wandering protagonist seeking redemption after his empire fell. A trope that reality TV audiences are far too media-savvy to accept without skepticism. And While Robin has remained more guarded publicly, her presence still looms over the entire narrative like a ghost of unresolved favoritism, because fans continue to believe that as long as Kody avoids openly acknowledging how dramatically his prioritization of her altered the family, any apology feels incomplete, and that this pilgrimage can never be authentic unless it confronts the structural imbalance that reshaped everything, not just the emotional fallout that followed. And as for Mary, Christine, and Janelle, each now represents a different mirror that reflects Kody's past back at him in uncomfortable ways, with Mary symbolizing prolonged neglect disguised as loyalty, Christine embodying the cost of emotional abandonment, and Janelle representing the slow erosion of financial and relational trust. And fans are watching closely to see whether Kody's words ever translate into actions toward these women that go beyond regretful sound bites, because real repentance would require sustained humility across time rather than a limited series of reflective appearances. And yet, despite the overwhelming skepticism, and as the so-called pilgrimage rolls on, what fascinates fans even more than Kody's shifting language is how carefully he now curates vulnerability, offering confessions that feel polished rather than raw, reflective rather than remorseful, and always delivered with an undertone of self-preservation that longtime viewers recognize as his emotional safety net, because even when he speaks about regret, it often lands as regret over consequences rather than regret over choices, a subtle distinction that has kept skepticism burning just beneath the surface of every sympathetic response. And nowhere is this more obvious than in how he frames the downfall of his plural family as a tragic inevitability rather than the cumulative result of years of favoritism, rigid control, and emotional withdrawal, which allows him to cast himself as both participant and casualty in the same breath. A narrative maneuver fans now spot instantly and call out just as quickly, particularly when he describes his loneliness as though it arrived without context, as though the isolation simply descended upon him rather than being built brick by brick through distance, conflict, and repeated refusal to bend. And yet, he seems genuinely startled by the depth of public resistance, as if he truly believed that calling this journey a pilgrimage would automatically recode it as sacred, untouchable, and worthy of reverence rather than scrutiny, a miscalculation that only further exposed the widening gap between how Kody sees himself and how the audience sees him, because to many viewers the word pilgrimage implies enduring suffering in pursuit of spiritual truth, while Kody's version appears to involve interviews, self-reflection, and public sympathy rather than the grinding humility of sustained, unglamorous accountability. And so each time he invokes destiny or divine prompting, fans counter with reminders of unanswered phone calls, unreturned apologies, and relationships that remain frozen in estrangement despite the supposed awakening. And this tension has turned the entire narrative into a kind of moral theater where intention and impact are weighed in real time, and the verdict is far from unanimous, yet overwhelmingly cautious, as if the public has learned from years of emotional whiplash not to confuse eloquence with evolution. And perhaps what unsettles viewers most is how Kody still appears most comfortable when he is narrating his own transformation rather than quietly living it, suggesting that the identity of being seen as changed may matter more to him than the slower, more painful work of becoming changed without an audience. And in that sense, the pilgrimage language feels less like self-effacement and more like myth-making, as though he is attempting to alchemize his fall from grace into a heroic exile, a necessary wandering that recasts loss as destiny rather than consequence. And fans have not missed the cultural script he seems to be invoking, because redemption arcs are a cornerstone of television storytelling, but what TV often compresses into a season or two requires years in reality, and the mismatch between narrative pacing and real emotional repair is one of the reasons this apology tour feels to many like a rushed third act rather than the beginning of an honest rebuilding process, particularly when so many of the people he claims to seek forgiveness from have either declined to participate publicly or remain conspicuously absent from his reflections, leaving viewers to wonder whether consent to this narrative has truly been granted or merely assumed. And this question of consent has become central to fan discourse, because repentance that centers the repentant without centering the injured risks reopening wounds rather than healing them, especially when those wounds were formed under the bright lights of reality television that transformed private pain into consumable content for years on end, and the audience, having borne witness to that pain, now feels a sense of moral guardianship over the narrative that Kody no longer exclusively controls, which is why his pilgrimage has become less about where he is going and more about who gets to define what this journey actually means. And in that struggle for narrative ownership, fans have emerged as the loudest arbiters, parsing every phrase, every pause, every contradiction between past and present statements, as if constructing a ledger of truth that no rebrand can erase. And this is especially evident in how often old clips resurface online immediately after Kody makes a reflective claim, creating an instant dialogue between past arrogance and current humility that reveals just how dramatic the tonal shift truly is. And while some viewers interpret that shift as genuine evolution born of loss and aging, others see it as a strategic recalibration designed to soften a legacy that hardened too visibly too quickly. And this split interpretation ensures that no matter how sincere Kody may or may not be, the pilgrimage will never be universally accepted as holy ground, because it is too entangled in unresolved history, too burdened by structural inequality within the former family, and too shadowed by public memory to exist as a clean slate. And yet there is also something undeniably human in watching someone confront the wreckage of their own authority after believing for so long that authority equaled righteousness, and this is the paradox that keeps audiences watching even as they critique, because beneath the spectacle lies a familiar reckoning that transcends reality TV. What happens when power dissolves and the stories we told ourselves to justify our choices can no longer withstand the evidence of what remains? And in Kody's case, what remains are fractured bonds, complicated loyalties, and children who grew up under conflicting versions of leadership, protection, and love, and whether or not his pilgrimage can bridge those distances remains an open question, but what viewers already understand is that reconciliation cannot be summoned by spiritual language alone, nor can it be accelerated by public approval. And so while Kody continues to speak of destiny, fate, and awakening, the emotional clock runs on a different schedule entirely, one that counts not in declarations but in consistency, not in proclamations but in presence. And until that presence materializes in the lives most impacted by his absence, the pilgrimage will remain suspended in symbolic limbo, revered by some, rejected by many, and endlessly debated by an audience that has watched enough transformations to know that the hardest part of change is not realizing what went wrong, but living differently when no one is applauding. And it is precisely that quiet, untelevised endurance that will determine whether Kody Brown's apology tour ultimately becomes a genuine pathway to reconciliation or simply another chapter in a long history of self-authored reinvention that promised transcendence yet delivered only another reframing of familiar consequences. As the public dissection of Kody Brown's so-called pilgrimage intensifies, entertainment insiders now say that what began as a loosely defined apology tour has quietly evolved into one of the most polarizing reputation experiments reality television has seen in years, because unlike past attempts at image repair that relied on silence or controlled spin, this effort is unfolding in full view of an audience that has grown increasingly sophisticated about media manipulation, redemption branding, and emotional performance. And that awareness has transformed every update into a referendum on authenticity itself, where sincerity is no longer assumed but interrogated with the same rigor once reserved for courtroom testimony. And sources close to the production world suggest that even within the industry there is unease about how this chapter is being framed, as producers, commentators, and former collaborators debate whether this narrative represents real growth or simply the latest evolution of a man long accustomed to shaping reality through storytelling, and that debate has only been fueled by the way Kody's language continues to oscillate between humility and heroism, between contrition and destiny, creating a tonal inconsistency that invites both sympathy and suspicion in equal measure. Because each time he emphasizes his brokenness, he seems to follow it with a grandiose interpretation of his journey, positioning himself not merely as someone seeking forgiveness but as someone chosen to undergo transformation for a higher purpose. a framing that critics argue subtly reclaims moral authority even as he claims to be relinquishing it, and it is precisely this tension that has kept fans locked in critical engagement rather than passive observation, turning comment sections into living archives of collective memory where old wounds are recatalogued every time he offers a new reflection. And in these digital town squares, the verdict remains sharply divided, with some viewers confessing that they feel conflicted watching a man finally articulate regrets they waited years to hear, while others argue that delayed accountability still inflicts harm by reopening emotional chapters without offering substantive repair, and this emotional whiplash is now part of the larger cultural footprint of the pilgrimage itself, which has outgrown Kody's personal narrative and morphed into a broader conversation about power, accountability, and the cost of public repentance in the age of perpetual visibility, because unlike private apologies that unfold in intimate spaces, Kody's reckonings are mediated by cameras, headlines, and fan interpretation, meaning that no apology can exist purely between two people anymore. It must also survive the court of public opinion where intention and impact are constantly renegotiated. And this dynamic has produced an unusual kind of stalemate where Kody speaks of healing, but the audience continues to audit the past as if healing itself must first pass a credibility test. And in that sense, his pilgrimage has become less a road toward forgiveness and more a prolonged examination of whether repentance can ever be disentangled from reputation when one's entire identity has been constructed in public view. And this is why every small shift in tone, every softened statement, every admission of fault becomes magnified into a headline moment, scrutinized not just for what it says but for what it avoids, particularly when it comes to the enduring specter of favoritism, because despite all the reflective language, Kody has yet to fully dismantle the hierarchy that once defined his family structure, instead referencing it obliquely as misunderstanding, misalignment, or circumstance, rather than calling it what many viewers believe it was. A gradual recentering of loyalty that left entire branches of the family emotionally orphaned, and until that core imbalance is confronted directly, fans argue that no amount of spiritual framing can convert this journey into true restitution, and yet the fact that such nuanced critique is now part of mainstream fan discourse speaks to how deeply invested audiences have become in the ethical dimensions of this story, no longer content to simply consume conflict, but compelled to interrogate the moral architecture beneath it, and that shift has changed the power dynamic permanently. Because Kody is no longer performing for a passive crowd but negotiating legitimacy with an audience that now sees itself as a stakeholder in truth, having borne witness to years of emotional labor, heartbreak, and narrative contradiction, and this collective memory acts like gravity, pulling every attempt at reinvention back toward the unresolved center where apologies, however eloquent, must compete with lived history, and this is perhaps the greatest obstacle of his pilgrimage. Not resistance from those who left, but resistance from the past itself, which refuses to be overwritten by symbolism alone. And yet, even amid this resistance, there are moments of unexpected empathy that surface in fan conversations, particularly among those who recognize in Kody's unraveling a universal reckoning familiar to anyone who has ever lost control of a story they once dominated, because stripped of the spectacle, his journey mirrors a deeply human crisis of identity that emerges when authority collapses and the scaffolding of self-justification falls away, leaving behind a quieter, more terrifying question of who one is without the validation of obedience. And it is in these rare moments that some viewers soften, acknowledging that while empathy does not erase accountability, it can coexist with it in complex ways. And these viewers argue that if the goal of accountability is transformation rather than punishment, then even imperfect attempts at reflection deserve cautious recognition, yet others counter that transformation measured only through words carries little moral weight in the absence of behavioral evidence, particularly when those most impacted remain silent or distant, and so the pilgrimage remains suspended between two interpretations that may never fully reconcile. One that sees it as a late but meaningful awakening, and another that views it as an elaborate coping mechanism designed to retrofit virtue onto loss. And as these interpretations compete in public discourse, the storyline continues to generate attention not because of what has been resolved, but because of what remains unresolved, namely whether Kody's search for forgiveness is aligned with the needs of those he seeks it from or primarily with his own need for narrative absolution. And this unresolved tension is what guarantees that the apology tour will not fade quietly into the background, but remain an open-ended saga where every update reactivates the same fundamental question. Can a man who once equated leadership with dominance now learn to equate accountability with surrender? And can that surrender occur under the microscope of fame without being distorted by the very incentives that once insulated him from consequence? And until that question is answered not through words but through sustained, consistent action outside the safety net of cameras and applause, Kody Brown's pilgrimage will continue to exist not as a destination reached, but as a journey endlessly evaluated by an audience that has learned, through years of observation, that true repentance is not declared in interviews, but revealed in the ordinary, untelevised choices where no redemption arc is guaranteed and no forgiveness is owed.